Have you ever wondered how a simple act of kindness could change multiple lives forever? In our world, where headlines often highlight division and discord, this is a story that reminds us of our shared humanity and the extraordinary connections that can bloom in the most unexpected moments. It was a bitterly cold December morning in Minneapolis when Sarah noticed her new neighbors struggling to unload a moving truck. Through the swirling snow, she could see a young mother trying to manage several boxes while keeping an eye on two small children bundled up against the cold. The father was attempting to maneuver a couch through their narrow front door, clearly fighting a losing battle against both the furniture and the weather. Sarah had always considered herself a good neighbor, the kind who'd wave hello and exchange pleasantries, but something about this scene tugged at her heart differently. Maybe it was the way the little girl, no more than 5, clutched her teddy bear while watching her parents with worried eyes. Or perhaps it was the obvious exhaustion on the mother's face as she tried to coordinate the chaos of moving day. Without overthinking it, Sarah pulled on her winter coat and boots. As she crossed the street, she could feel the crunch of fresh snow beneath her feet, each step bringing her closer to what would become one of the most meaningful relationships of her life, though she didn't know it yet. "Need an extra pair of hands," she called out, her breath visible in the frigid air. The father looked up, relief washing over his tired face. The mother paused, shifting the box in her arms, a mix of surprise and gratitude in her expression. What started as a simple offer to help carry boxes soon turned into Sarah inviting the whole family into her house for hot chocolate and warmth. As the children's cheeks regained their color and the parents finally had a moment to catch their breath, stories began to flow. The family had moved from Georgia after James, the father, received a promising job offer in healthcare. But the timing couldn't have been worse. The housing market was brutal, moving costs had drained their savings, and winter had arrived earlier than expected. That day marked the beginning of something beautiful, but it wasn't without its initial awkward moments. There were hesitations, careful conversations, and the delicate dance of two families from different backgrounds learning to trust each other. The mother, Nicole, would later confess that she'd been skeptical of Sarah's help at first, conditioned by past experiences to expect ulterior motives. The children, however, proved to be the great equalizer. Sarah's teenage son, who had initially rolled his eyes at his mother's getting involved in everything, found himself teaching the little ones how to build proper snowmen. The kids didn't see color or social divisions. They saw only potential playmates and the promise of fun. As the weeks passed, the relationship deepened beyond mere neighborly courtesy. When Nichols' car wouldn't start on a crucial workday, Sarah didn't hesitate to offer a ride. When Sarah's son needed help with his science project, James, with his medical background, spent hours explaining complex concepts in ways that finally made sense. But it wasn't until 3 months later that their bond would truly be tested. Sarah noticed something was wrong when the usually bright lights of her neighbor's home remained dark for several evenings in a row. The children weren't playing in the yard, and James's car hadn't moved from its spot. What she discovered next would challenge both families in ways they never expected, and prove that sometimes the family you choose can be just as strong as the family you're born into. As their lives became increasingly intertwined, both families began to realize that their chance encounter on that snowy December morning wasn't just about moving boxes or offering shelter from the cold. It was about breaking down walls, challenging preconceptions, and building bridges in a world that often seems determined to keep people apart. But before we delve into the crisis that would test their newfound friendship, let's rewind a bit and look at the small moments that laid the foundation for what was to come. Because sometimes it's in these quiet, everyday interactions that the most profound changes take root. In those first few months, the small gestures spoke volumes. There was the time Nicole noticed Sarah struggling with her garden and shared her grandmother's secrets for growing the perfect tomatoes, knowledge passed down through generations of her family in Georgia. Or when Sarah's son started teaching the kids how to ride bikes in the spring, spending patient hours running alongside them until they found their balance. The neighborhood watched with curiosity as these two families gradually merged their lives. Sunday dinners became a tradition, alternating between houses. The aroma of Nichols' soul food classics would mingle with Sarah's Midwestern comfort dishes, creating a unique fusion that represented their growing bond. Children's birthday parties, homework sessions, and impromptu backyard barbecues became shared experiences rather than separate celebrations. But it wasn't always smooth sailing. There were moments of misunderstanding that required honest conversations, like when Sarah's elderly mother visited and made some outdated comments that created tension at the dinner table. Instead of letting it fester, both families faced the uncomfortable situation head-on, turning it into a teaching moment for everyone, including the children. James and Nicole's adjustment to Minnesota life had its challenges too. The harsh winter was unlike anything they'd experienced in Georgia, and the cultural differences were more pronounced than they'd anticipated. Sarah became their unofficial guide to northern living, helping them navigate everything from winter driving to finding the right schools for the kids. Behind their growing friendship lay deeper stories that gradually emerged. Nicole revealed her struggles with feeling isolated in their previous neighborhood, where being the only black family had meant keeping to themselves. Sarah opened up about her own battles with anxiety and how helping others had become her way of pushing past her comfort zone. The children's friendship blossomed in unexpected ways. Sarah's teenage son, initially reluctant to play with younger kids, found himself enjoying the role of mentor. He taught them to build snow forts, helped with homework, and even started a neighborhood basketball game that became a weekly event. The little ones looked up to him with pure adoration, and he grew more confident and responsible through their interactions. But then came that week in early spring when things began to change. The first sign was subtle, James missing the weekly basketball game. Then Nicole started declining dinner invitations, citing work commitments. The children, usually bursting with energy, became quieter, their play less boisterous. Sarah noticed more takeout containers in their recycling bin, replacing the usual home-cooked meals that had filled their house with wonderful aromas. One evening, Sarah saw Nicole sitting alone on their front porch, staring into the distance long after sunset. The weight of whatever burden she carried was visible in the slump of her shoulders. Sarah wanted to rush over to ask what was wrong, but something held her back. Years of experience had taught her that sometimes people needed space before they could open up. Little did Sarah know that the next morning would bring a phone call that would change everything. As her phone rang at 5:30 a.m., she had no way of knowing that this call would test not just their friendship, but their entire belief in what it means to be there for one another. That early morning phone call changed everything. Sarah's hands trembled as she listened to Nicole's voice, barely a whisper, on the other end. "I didn't know who else to call," Nicole said, her words broken by quiet sobs. Without hesitation, Sarah was pulling on her shoes, grabbing her car keys, and rushing across the street. What she found in her neighbor's house that morning would challenge everything she thought she knew about strength, family, and the true meaning of community. The usually immaculate living room was cluttered with papers, medical bills, insurance forms, and hospital letterhead scattered across the coffee table. James sat motionless on the couch, still in his scrubs from the night shift, staring at something in his hands that Sarah couldn't see. The children were still asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in their parents' lives. Nicole led Sarah to the kitchen, where cold coffee sat untouched in mugs from the previous night. As they sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they had shared so many joyful meals, Nicole finally began to explain. James had been experiencing severe headaches for weeks. At first, they dismissed it as stress from the new job and the move. But then came the dizziness, the temporary vision problems, and finally, a frightening episode during his hospital shift that couldn't be ignored. The initial medical tests had come back with results that sent their world spinning. "We haven't told anyone yet," Nicole confessed, her voice steady despite her tears. "We've been trying to figure out how to handle this on our own. But," she gestured to the pile of papers in the living room, "the insurance isn't covering everything, and with the new house mortgage." Sarah listened, her heart growing heavier with each word. The family had exhausted their savings with the move and house down payment. The specialized treatment James needed would require traveling to a medical center in another state. The financial burden was crushing, but even more devastating was the emotional toll it was taking on the family. The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the windows when they heard small footsteps on the stairs. Nicole quickly wiped her eyes, putting on a brave face for her children. Sarah watched as this strong woman transformed in an instant, shielding her children from the weight she carried. That moment sparked something in Sarah. As she walked back to her house later that morning, her mind was already racing with possibilities. She thought about her own network, the neighborhood association she led, her connections at the local community center, her sister's experience with medical fundraising. But more than that, she thought about how this family had become so much more than just neighbors. What happened next would test the bounds of friendship, challenge the limits of community support, and reveal just how deeply connected their lives had become. But as Sarah stood in her kitchen, making calls and sending messages, she had no way of knowing that her actions would spark a chain reaction that would ripple through their entire community. As word began to spread, people's reactions varied. Some stepped forward immediately, while others held back, unsure about getting involved in such a personal crisis. The next 48 hours would prove crucial, not just for James's future treatment, but for the very fabric of their neighborhood community. Sarah found herself at the center of a growing movement, but with each step forward, new challenges emerged. How much should they share publicly? How could they help while preserving the family's dignity? And most importantly, would their efforts be enough to make a real difference? The answer to these questions would come in an unexpected way, through a series of events that no one could have predicted. But first, the community would have to confront some uncomfortable truths about themselves and their assumptions about helping others. Just as the community began rallying around James and his family, an unexpected revelation threatened to complicate everything. During a planning meeting for the fundraiser at Sarah's house, Nicole received a call that made her step outside. When she returned, her face had drained of color. The specialist hospital they'd been counting on had just called. There had been a mistake in their paperwork. The treatment program they'd been approved for was actually full, with a waiting list stretching months into the future. The news hit like a physical blow. Months of waiting wasn't an option. James's condition was progressing too quickly. The alternative treatment center was in Seattle, nearly twice as far away, with costs that far exceeded their original plans. The financial goal they'd set for the fundraiser suddenly seemed painfully inadequate. But that wasn't the only challenge they faced. As word of their situation spread through social media and local news, an uncomfortable spotlight began to shine on their story. Some questioned why this particular family deserved such community support when others had faced similar hardships alone. Anonymous comments appeared online, suggesting that Sarah's involvement was motivated by white savior complex rather than genuine friendship. The criticism stung Sarah deeply, making her question her every move. Should she step back? Was she overstepping? The last thing she wanted was to make things harder for Nicole and James. But when she tried to distance herself, Nicole showed up at her door late one night, kids in tow. "You don't get to walk away now," Nicole said firmly, her voice thick with emotion. "Not because some strangers online think they know our story. They weren't there that first day in the snow. They don't know about all the nights we've spent laughing in each other's kitchens. They don't get to define what we mean to each other." That conversation sparked a turning point, but not in the way anyone expected. The next morning, while dropping the kids at school, Sarah overheard a conversation that would change everything. Two teachers were discussing a recent incident at a neighboring school where a student had organized an incredibly successful fundraiser using an innovative approach that combined social media with local business partnerships. Sarah's mind began racing. What if they could adapt that idea? But as she dug deeper into the possibility, she uncovered something even more significant. A little-known medical grant program that might help bridge the gap. The catch? The application deadline was just 3 days away, and the paperwork was overwhelming. Meanwhile, James's condition took another unexpected turn. During a routine checkup, his doctor noticed something concerning in his latest test results. The timeline they thought they had suddenly compressed. What was once urgent became critical. The community response needed to shift into high gear, but doubts and divisions had already taken root. Some local business owners who had initially promised support began to hesitate, worried about potential controversy. The original fundraising event they'd planned now seemed woefully insufficient, Yet attempting something bigger risked drawing more unwanted attention. Sarah found herself walking a tightrope, trying to respect the family's privacy while gathering the support they desperately needed. The irony wasn't lost on her that the very attention that could save James's life was also threatening to tear apart the delicate fabric of their community. As pressure mounted from all sides, a surprising ally emerged from an unexpected corner of their neighborhood, someone with connections to both the medical and fundraising worlds, who had been silently watching the situation unfold. Their involvement would add yet another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation, forcing everyone to confront their own biases and assumptions about community, race, and the true meaning of solidarity. But before this new development could play out, a late-night emergency would force everyone's hands, bringing all the simmering tensions to a boiling point. The late-night emergency came without warning. Sarah's phone rang at 2 a.m. James had collapsed at home. As she raced across the street, she could hear the distant wail of approaching sirens. The next few hours in the emergency room became a blur of fluorescent lights and worried faces, with Nicole clutching her husband's hand while Sarah watched over their sleeping children in the waiting room. That crisis became the catalyst for something extraordinary. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than the morning light, and by dawn, people began showing up at the hospital, not just with flowers or cards, but with purpose. The mysterious ally, who turned out to be a retired healthcare administrator living 3 doors down, arrived with a team of volunteers and laptops. What happened next demonstrated the true power of community in action. The retired administrator, Mrs. Chen, had spent the past week quietly working her connections. She discovered that James qualified for a special medical research program at the Seattle facility, one that could cover a significant portion of his treatment costs. The catch? They needed to complete the application within hours, and it required extensive documentation. The hospital waiting room transformed into an impromptu command center. While medical staff stabilized James, neighbors took shifts organizing paperwork, making calls, and coordinating with insurance representatives. Sarah's teenage son surprised everyone by setting up a secure digital system to manage the documentation, something he learned in his computer science class. But the most unexpected turn came from Nicole's social media post about that first snowy day, the day Sarah had crossed the street to help. The post went viral, catching the attention of a national news network. Suddenly, their story wasn't just about one family's medical crisis or one neighborhood's response. It became a symbol of hope, of what's possible when people choose to see beyond their differences and really show up for each other. The momentum built rapidly. Local businesses that had hesitated before now stepped forward boldly. The fundraiser expanded beyond their wildest expectations, with communities across the city joining in. But it wasn't just about the money. People offered their skills, their time, and their resources in ways no one could have predicted. Then came the moment that changed everything. During a community meeting at the local church, while everyone was focused on the fundraising updates, James walked in. He was pale and needed support, but he was standing. The room fell silent as he made his way to the front, Nicole at his side. "I need to say something," he began, his voice weak but determined. This started with one person choosing to help strangers on a cold day. Look what that simple choice created. He gestured to the room full of people, many of whom had become like family over the past months. "The doctors say I have a fighting chance now, but that's not the real miracle here. The real miracle is what's happened to all of us." That's when Mrs. Chen stood up with tears in her eyes and revealed one final surprise. The medical research program hadn't just accepted James. They wanted to use their story as a model for community-based patient support programs across the country. The very obstacles they'd faced had helped create a blueprint for other communities facing similar challenges. As the room erupted in celebration, Sarah caught Nicole's eye across the crowd. They shared a look that spoke volumes, about friendship that transcends boundaries, about communities that rise above prejudices, about hope that springs from the darkest moments. Their story had come full circle, from that first snowy morning to this moment of triumph, but it wasn't really ending. It was transforming into something bigger than themselves. The following week, as James prepared for his journey to Seattle, the entire neighborhood gathered for a send-off celebration. Children played in the same yard where they'd first learned to ride bikes together. Adults shared dishes that represented their diverse backgrounds and experiences, and in quiet conversations throughout the evening, new connections formed, new friendships began. Sarah watched it all from her porch, marveling at how a simple choice to help her neighbors had rippled out in ways she never could have imagined. As the sun set on their gathering, she realized that their story wasn't just about overcoming a medical crisis. It was about the extraordinary things that happen when ordinary people choose to open their hearts and reach across the divisions that too often keep us apart. The real surprise wasn't that they had succeeded in helping James. The real surprise was how helping James had helped heal their entire community. 1 year later, the neighborhood had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. James had returned from Seattle, not just surviving but thriving after his treatment. The medical research program that grew from their experience had already helped 3 other families across the country, proving that their struggle had created lasting change beyond their own community. The weekly community dinners that started during the fundraising efforts had become a cherished tradition. Every Sunday, families gathered in different homes, sharing meals that told their own stories of heritage and hope. Sarah's garden, once her solitary hobby, had expanded into a community project, with vegetables and flowers spilling into several connected backyards. The produce now supplied not just their neighborhood dinners, but also the local food bank. Nicole had taken on a leadership role in the hospital's new patient advocacy program, using their experience to help other families navigate similar challenges. Her children, once shy newcomers, had blossomed into confident kids who proudly told their story to anyone who would listen. They especially loved sharing how their neighborhood came together like a big family during the tough times. Sarah's teenage son, inspired by his role in organizing the digital documentation system, started a tech club at his high school. The club focused on using technology to solve community problems, carrying forward the spirit of innovation that had helped save James's life. Mrs. Chen, the retired healthcare administrator who had been their unexpected ally, didn't stop with James's case. She created a network of retired healthcare professionals who volunteered their expertise to help families understand their medical options and navigate insurance challenges. What started as one person's intervention had grown into a sustainable support system for the entire community. The story of that snowy December morning became part of the neighborhood's shared history, but it was no longer just about 2 families bridging their differences. It had evolved into a testament to what becomes possible when people choose connection over division, action over hesitation, and hope over fear. On the anniversary of James's return home, as neighbors gathered for a celebration in the community park they had renovated together, Sarah and Nicole found themselves sitting on the same porch where their story began. Their children played basketball in the driveway, a game that had once been just a weekly ritual, but was now a symbol of their intertwined lives. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Nicole asked, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "If you hadn't decided to come help us that day." Sarah smiled, understanding the weight of that unfinished thought. "I think about that too. But I also think about what you taught me, about being brave enough to accept help, about standing strong in the face of judgment, about building something bigger than ourselves." As the evening wound down and families began heading home, the sound of laughter and conversation echoed through the streets. The neighborhood had become more than just a collection of houses. It was a living example of how small actions of kindness could spark profound changes, how crisis could forge unbreakable bonds, and how the simple choice to help a neighbor could ripple out to touch countless lives. Their story didn't end there. It lived on in the daily choices of every person who heard it, inspiring others to take that first step across whatever divisions separated them from their neighbors. Because sometimes the most extraordinary transformations begin with the simplest decision: to reach out, to connect, to care.